I'm supposed to start now. Mike is waving at me. I got it. I want to welcome all of you and to the audience that is streaming in to this, and know that you can watch this later if you miss something or really have to see it again on our YouTube channel, as we have done with the other events, symposia that we've had. Before I announce tonight's event and tell you a little bit about it, I want to give you some CASBS news. We have a project in mind to expand CASBS slightly and to create some fabulous collaborative space, preserving it as it's been historically, but also bringing it into the 21st century in terms of high tech and places where people can really meet. And that required us to raise $5 million by May 1st, and then the additional money over the next year, and we did it. So this is I'm really excited. So it will be seen in various ways throughout the evening. Okay, this is the third symposium of the year in a series that's been focused on the relations among humans, technology, AI. And each of the symposia has involved our fellows and faculty fellows, so our resident fellows who are here for the year, and those who are part of this larger community of CASBS. And each of them has focused on a different set of issues around technology. This one, as I hope you know, is focused on politics and government and how technology affects both of those. And we have two remarkable people who are fellows this year who will be giving short presentations, and then we will have a moderated discussion, which will include me. And then we will open it up for questions from the rest of you. So the second speaker, but the first person I will introduce alphabetically, is Carrie Chihak, who is the Chief of Policy for the highest elected official in King County, Washington, which is the larger Seattle area. It's the metropolitan area of Seattle. And it's where I live during the weekends and where I vote, and I can tell you for sure that it is one of the most exciting and innovative governments in the country, and that's in no small part due to Carrie's work. She has a wonderful county executive in Dow Constantine, who she works for, but she's been a real force behind a lot of the innovations and the thinking and the evaluation of what's going on. And one of the things she's been doing here as a CASBS fellow, and will continue to do even after she leaves CASBS, is to help us create an impact evaluation design lab as part of our evidence-informed policy initiative. She does that as part of a team of people, another of whom is a fellow here this year, Graham Gottlieb. And the third leader in that core group is Jake Bowers, who will be a fellow here next year. So you can sort of see how these things work. And they've been working very closely with two governments as they begin to explore how to make this kind of project, which is really based on how to do some very different ways of evaluating policy so that we put into place and sustain and evaluate as we go along policies that actually work and serve the purposes they're meant to serve, or serve better purposes as you learn things, and deal with unintended consequences. So they have projects right now in King County, as well as in Stockton, California. And as I said, this is a demonstration project. It's one of the first of its kind ever. It is the first of its kind ever. But very linked to a lot of other projects that are going on in this space. And it's been very exciting to host it here. The other speaker is Nate Persily, who's at the law school. He's the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford, but we've luckily had him up here this year. And he regularly asks us for permission to depart for a while so that he can do work that is under one of his many hats, which is to rewrite districts, to redraw districts, the state legislative districts in North Carolina, and most recently the congressional districts in Pennsylvania, which she has gotten some press about. Yeah. He's nonpartisan, at least on this. Okay, but the other thing that he really thinks hard about and is very engaged with is thinking about the effects of the web, the internet, bots, all of that whole bunch of stuff on democracy and how it influences our voting, our thinking, our actions, our information and disinformation. If you haven't read his 2017 article in the Journal of Democracy, Can Democracy Survive the Internet? I recommend that you do. And again, in this second hat, he's also gotten some press recently because he, with board member Gary King, CASBS board member Gary King, who's also a Harvard professor, are the leaders of an initiative which is getting access to Facebook data to analyze it, to understand better the ways in which democracy is actually influenced by the way in which the internet and particularly social media in the form of Facebook is organized. And that's a big project that is being administered by the Social Science Research Council and is being funded by an extraordinary consortium of funders that include the Hewlett Foundation and the Knight Foundation, but also the Koch Foundation, just to give you a sense of the range. And many others are now signing on to it. So we're gonna start with Nate, who promises me he's gonna give a version of the talk I've heard 5 or 6 times. But I'm so excited about the CASBS building that I'll stay wide awake. No, it's a great talk. And then Carrie will follow. Each will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll have 15 or 20 minutes of discussion followed by question and answer.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Margaret, for this year. It is, I mean, as I'm sure is the case with most fellows, toward the end, you are going to have to pry this from my cold, dead hands, my study, right? It's been a wonderful year, and thank you to all the fellows who've come here today. So as Margaret said, I'm a law of democracy person. So that's the class I teach down at Stanford and the area of my research, whether it's voting rights or campaign finance, redistricting, political parties, and the like. And so my entree into this topic of the influence of the internet on democracy originally came from 2 strands of research that I've been doing. One on political polarization as sort of a political scientist. I often say that you can tell, I'm a political scientist as well as a law professor, as well as Margaret mentioned, and someone who works in this area. I often say you can tell when I'm a political scientist because I have data without opinions. You can tell when I'm a law professor because I have opinions without data. And you can tell when I'm a lawyer because, well, it depends what my client says. So I think you've heard that 3 times as well.
But I always laugh.
But you know, 70% of you haven't. So my entree into this topic of the influence of the internet on democracy was both from the polarization research and also campaign finance. When the much maligned Supreme Court decision in Citizens United versus FEC came down, most people looked at it and criticized it as giving corporations First Amendment rights or treating corporations like people. I saw that case more as an example or a sort of touchstone for how the changing telecommunications environment would dovetail with the First Amendment. Because that case, which we mostly think of as about corporate advertising, was actually about an on-demand movie that a nonprofit corporation put up on on-demand programming that you could download. And in the case and in the discussion surrounding it, there was all this question about whether the way we've thought about regulation of politics, particularly political money, has been predicated on television and linear programming as being the main way that politicians and groups communicate with voters. And if you sort of look at the case and the atmospherics around it, that is in some ways the most significant aspect of the case, is trying to figure out how this architecture of communications regulation that was set in place for the television era could be adapted to the internet age. if you look at this sort of studying of democracy and the internet over the last 20 years, right, we've moved from sort of utopianism to dystopianism, right, with the 2016 election as being the kind of breaking point. So this article that Margaret referenced was my attempt to move from what was the sort of literature on thinking about the internet as an empowerment tool for small voices that had been excluded by the media intermediaries to the now dark side of the internet, which is things like hate speech and bots and fake news and the like. So let me just give you the now 6-minute version of this longer talk that I often give, and that is about what is the problem. When we talk about whether democracy can survive the internet, what is sort of the unique problem that the internet poses for democracy? And so the sort of overarching concern, I think, is that to the extent that we, particularly in the United States, have thought that the marketplace of ideas, right, the unregulated marketplace of ideas is the best test for truth, it's not clear that that's ever been true, but it's not true in the internet age, okay? So that if we thought that truth will win out through more voices sort of battling it out on the internet, the empirics just don't seem to be there. There are other consequences to that, and that is that to the extent we've thought that democracy is about a conversation among nationals in that political system who are human, how do you reconcile that with the internet age in which anyone from around the world can basically be part of the political and electoral conversation of a country, to the point where the country is the government's really unable to regulate it except through draconian means, and the fact that it's not limited to humans, right? That bots or what we call computational propaganda can play an important role in that conversation as well. Okay? And so those are sort of the overarching questions. But I think it's important not to think about these questions along the lines that we often talk about them. So fake news, as difficult a moniker as that generally is not the problem, okay? And that is, it is not a problem that is unique to the internet age, right? Fake news is as old as news, hate speech is as old as speech. And so the question that I try to answer is, well, what is it about the new technology? What is it about the internet that poses unique threats to democracy? And so let me just set forth what those are. The first is sort of a family of problems, which we can call velocity, virality, and volume, okay? The speed at which information travels, the fact that it is not mediated by elites, but it's done through viral transfer, and then the sheer amount of communication that's out there, which requires some kind of curation by platforms and others, right? There's a sort of, if you look on the web, you can find Mark Twain as having said in 1917 that, a lie makes its way halfway around the world before the truth puts its boots on, right? Turns out Mark Twain was dead by 1917, so this is another example of where the internet gets it wrong, but the point still holds, right? And in thinking about whether the marketplace of ideas can regulate that phenomenon, when you there's always been a problem with rumors. And we should not pretend that all of these problems are new to the internet. But the speed at which information travels is just a difference in kind, if not significantly in degree. The viral transfer of information, right, and communication is obviously one of the defining features of the internet age, because to the extent we relied on intermediaries like Walter Cronkite to tell us at the end of the evening news, that's just the way it is, right? No one has the credibility to do that anymore, right? So you do not have trusted intermediaries that have a national audience and that can filter what are the sort of permissible bounds of political conversation. Now, let's be clear, right? Those intermediaries, those elites, curbed discussion of all kinds of contentious issues and excluded voices that should have been heard, whether it's racial minorities or political minorities or ideological groups. Nevertheless, while excluding those on the far left and on the far right, it did have some kind of filtering mechanism for what was permissible discourse. In addition to those problems of velocity, virality, and volume, you also have the problem of anonymity. And so while Anonymity is, again, not new to the internet, and it is even constitutionally protected. Let's not forget that the Publius wrote the Federalist Papers, right? So Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. You've seen the play, right? So, wrote under a pseudonym for various reasons, and even under the First Amendment, anonymous speech is often protected. But with the protection that the internet gives anonymous speakers, you have both the hate speech problem and the bot problem. Because the bot problem, right, the ability of computers essentially to impersonate individual speakers, is a function of the fact that on the internet you cannot see the person that you are talking to, right? Now, bots have all kinds of other problems. They manipulate search engines. They artificially seem to suggest support for political leaders, including our president, who's retweeted bots 150 times. And that's not an exaggeration. He has retweeted bots over 150 times. But the problem with bots and anonymity is the same, and hate speech is the same, which is our inability to figure out who the speaker is behind the speech, right? There is actually an interesting sort of line of research right now as to whether sort of hate speech has been going up online, right? Whether our online lives are more uncivil. If you look at Twitter, it's not clear that over the last 2 years, like the share of speech, which is hate speech, has actually been going up. Nevertheless, through the internet, whether it's on Reddit or 4chan or all these other kind of sort of cauldrons of hate that have dark corners on the internet, you can do something on the internet that you couldn't do in the real world, which is to find like-minded people that share an extreme point of view, whether it's for beneficent reasons, of people who want to mobilize against the government, say in far off places, or as we've seen here, to share conspiracy theories about what's happening in a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. So beyond that, there's also the problem of what we, in the social scientists who look at this, the problem of homophily or echo chambers, right? That Cass Sunstein, has been my Harvard colleague, has been the progenitor of this in 3 different books on the exact same topic. And wait, this is being taped, isn't it? Which I recommend to all of you. But the argument, the point is that the internet allows us to self-select into our own filter bubbles, information cocoons, and the like, and that it allows for self-reinforcement, which is an engine of polarization. Now, one of the problems here is that, again, it's not clear that our online lives are actually more homophilous or homogeneous than our offline lives, because we tend to live in pretty politically homogeneous neighborhoods. But for the same reason I was talking about hate speech before, you can find a homogeneous community on the internet that shares your political beliefs much more easily than you can in the real world. So if you want, if you're interested in particular types of cat videos, right, there's an internet website for you. The last 2 problems, and then I'll stop, are first this problem of sovereignty, right, which is the ability of a government to control the electoral and political conversation to its own nationals or citizens. And so we have thought of whether it's the FCC or the FEC or some government body in the US and their analogs elsewhere as having a role to secure the democracy and to set rules for permissible political activity. In the internet age, with the web, which is worldwide after all, it is extremely difficult for a government to do that. Case in point, of course, is the whole Russia investigation that we're undergoing right now. But if you talk to folks in other countries, it's like, the US is late to the party here. This has been happening all over the world. And if you talk to intelligence officials or others, it's only accelerating. And then new actors are taking cues from what happened in the 2016 election. And, this is just again, a unique feature of the internet. There are, of course, examples of where the U.S. has tried to influence elections around the world prior to, the modern internet era. But when you can't tell the difference between, a Russian troll or cyborg or bot and a domestic speaker, it becomes increasingly difficult for the government to control the electoral universe in the way it had previously. The final problem is the problem of monopoly, and that is the role that particularly Facebook and Google play in structuring the political conversation and the way that information travels in this new ecosystem. I'll have a lot to say about that. Maybe we'll talk more about that in the questions. But these platforms are characteristically different than CBS, NBC, and their predecessors, right? The rules that these platforms have for electoral and political conversation are more important in many ways than formal law that comes from government. And so the terms of service and community guidelines and what they're going to say is permissible and what's going to violate their policies is absolutely critical in determining the political conversation in the run-up to elections. And even more importantly, the sort of hidden rules that feed the algorithm are absolutely essential in understanding what types of information get prioritized in someone's news feed or Twitter feed or search results. And so those kind of decisions about how to prioritize some types of information over others really are the sort of critical ingredients to determining influence in elections.
Thank you, Nate. I forgot to announce that we actually have a co-sponsor of tonight. I shouldn't have left out our co-sponsor, which is the Cybersecurity Initiative, which both Nate and I are involved with in trying to establish some rules about some of these kinds of things that you were talking about. Carrie.
Hi, everybody. I want to give a shout out to all of my friends and colleagues back in King County who are also tuning in. And it's really great to be here paired with Nate. You can see the rich intellectual environment in which I've been steeped over the last year. And so really want to thank the Center and Margaret particularly for that. I'm really going to talk about quite a different perspective, which is the perspective of regional and local governments in this new technology environment. And I want to introduce 3 topics that you might not have quite thought about before related to the impact of technology on local government. And then I'm going to pose some questions in those areas that we as communities really need to address. So the 3 topics are digital equity, government's regulatory role, and at the local government level, and then the impact of the tech industry on our communities, particularly communities like the one I'm from, the Seattle region, and here in Silicon Valley. So around that first topic of digital equity, I thought it was a popular conception to view technology as the great equalizer, and I went onto a popular search engine to check that out, and I ended up getting 8.7 million hits. So I think it's fair to say that that's a common perception. But there's a big tension between the promise of tech as the great equalizer and the reality of tech as an accelerator. And tech as an accelerator is going to accelerate many, many things, including a thing that I'm very concerned about, which is widening inequities in our communities. Increasingly, tech holds the key for each of us to fulfill our own potential and, in fact, even meet some of our most basic needs. Governments are using technology in new ways. Some of them are matters of convenience. Does anybody remember having to go down to the DMV to renew your driver's license? We can now do it online, which is a great convenience. But some of those ways that government is using tech are actually kind of life and death matters. Tech was used a lot, just north of here to get wildfire alerts out to people with, some success and some not such great success. And of course, it's, a point of access for people around employment, housing, education. All of those things are increasingly dependent upon our access to technology. So tech is only going to become that great equalizer if we actually equalize access to tech. And in the United States and in many of our communities, we're not doing such a hot job of that, actually. So my home state of Washington has the highest in-home broadband adoption rate in the country. California is not far behind. And 82% of households in Washington state have broadband internet access. That might sound really high, but of course, the flip side of that is obviously 18%, or nearly 1 in 5 households, do not have broadband reliable, ready access. And that 18% is not evenly distributed. Low-income households, particularly households who earn less than $50,000 a year, which are disproportionately households of color, they're 5 times more likely not to have broadband access at home. Now, I often hear people say, well, we don't really have to worry about that because, right, reach into your pocket, we all have the smartphone. And it's actually not true. So for people who are earning under $30,000 in the United States, over 30% of those people don't have a smartphone. And those who do have a smartphone and rely on their internet access through a smartphone, it's not that easy, right? Think about trying to fill out a job application on a smartphone, or think about your own child trying to do their homework on a smartphone. And you know, the cost of data, the cost of devices is also a huge barrier to people. So that digital inequity is something that we should all be really concerned about. It's exacerbated in the United States by the fact that we typically pay more for internet access than people in Europe and Asia do, for speeds that are less. And we typically have very little choice in who our provider is. We have an opportunity in the US coming up in the next few years to boost speed, ease, affordability, access, and equity as we roll out 5G. That's going to make wireless very comparable to broadband speeds we have today, but it's going to really require us to take a planful approach, and that's probably going to have to happen community by community. So the second topic I wanted to hit on is regards local government's regulatory role in this new tech environment. And I'm going to take a very different spin from what you've heard Nate talk about, or what you've heard a lot of talk about with regard to privacy considerations, and really, again, speak from the local government perspective. The emergence of technology-based services is really providing a lot of challenges and questions around local government's role as a regulator. Through the platform economy, we can share stuff, we can get stuff delivered, and we can get stuff done for us. There's ride share, home rentals, meal share, dockless bikes and scooter share. We have food, alcohol, and marijuana delivery. I realize that for some of you, that's probably not a new feature. We have moving, home repair, cleaning, and even massage services that are on demand and literally at the tips of our fingertips. And, you know, if you think about it, many of these enterprises, they have very few employees, they have very little physical infrastructure, they can scale up very, very quickly. Other technologies like autonomous vehicles are going to take longer time to come to scale, but they could completely really transform our lives and our living environments. And there's lots of really wonderful positive benefits we all derive from the platform economy: better social connection, sharing of resources, more control over the use of our time. But there's a tension between those positive benefits and the expectations we have regarding safety and fairness when we sort of enter into this public commons space that tech is providing us. And we have to rethink the role of local government in regulating those public commons. So, you know, just take a minute to think about it. Like, it's kind of crazy that you are willing to get into a complete stranger's car and have them drive you around, or that you are willing to let strangers into your car. We're willing to have people we have never met prepare food for us that we will eat. And the only reason we're really unwilling to undertake those kinds of activities is because we've built an expectation that it's safe, that there's some kind of system behind all of that activity that is looking out for us as consumers. And when we're in places, like when we travel to places where we don't really feel that that system is there, we act in really, really different ways. And it does not take much for our confidence in those systems to be undermined. So, heretofore, a lot of our expectations that allow those markets to work have been built on the backbone of a government regulatory structure. And the emergence of that platform economy and the pace of innovation is really challenging that regulatory structure. So I'm going to pose some questions about local government's regulatory role in 4 areas: the balance of risk and responsibility, ensuring a fair and non-discriminatory market, the benefits of cooperation, and active design of our physical environments of our communities. So with regard to the balance of risk and responsibility, who holds that in the platform economy? Is it the platform itself? Is it us as consumers? Is it workers? Or is it the government? Or is it some combination of these? Businesses in the platform economy often claim to just be matchmakers, that they're doing nothing more than providing the platform, and so they can't be subject to regulation. But what are our expectations as consumers or workers as to the responsibilities those platforms should hold, and how government should regulate them to quality standards, treatment, rights of workers or independent contractors, liability, and the like? And where do we draw that balance between our private assumption of risk and our expectation regarding the role of government in regulating these kinds of business activities? As consumers, it's a little bit of a paradox for me. I see as consumers, we're demanding more and more information from government about restaurant food safety, placarding. You see lots of placarding. That's much more transparent going on. So how much more risk are we willing to assume ourselves when we dine in someone's home, someone that we don't know, through a meal sharing app? And are expectations different if that person's providing 100 meals a week versus 5 meals a week? These are questions that we have to answer. So the second area underneath the regulatory role of government is around ensuring a fair and non-discriminatory market. And here there are really 2 issues. One is equal treatment of like business activity, and the second is equal access for consumers. There's a tension in businesses' desire for government to. And then another role of government regulation in the traditional business community has been ensuring non-discrimination. Taxi companies, when they're licensed, typically have to agree to serve an entire community. Of course, that doesn't always work out exactly the way we want it to, but we do have some principles and standards and enforcement mechanisms around that. Hotels can't discriminate against who wants to rent rooms from them. So how do we ensure these new business models also aren't discriminatory? A third area around local government's role in regulating new technology is really the need for more cooperation. And that's both between businesses and government as well as among governments. We typically tend to view businesses and governments as being in opposition around regulatory structures. And in fact, a lot of these new businesses appear to be taking the tactic of avoiding regulators, and then begging, or in fact, even demanding forgiveness later. And, that's often at the peril of the first runners in these industries. They may end up having their operations shut down, incurring legal fees, running out of working capital before the regulatory frameworks can catch up. So how can we really foster a more open approaches between business and government that can benefit both the business environment and our public interest as well? And then governments are also struggling to keep up with the pace at which these new business models are emerging. And we could really benefit from governments cooperating more across boundaries. It doesn't make sense if you have a bike share in one small community here, but you can't take the bike into another community over here. So trying to find some common frameworks for regulation across jurisdictional boundaries, but also to share ideas and create more common frameworks for the business environment. And then the last issue I want to address with respect to government's regulatory role is the power of new technologies to really reshape in a significant way the physical environment of our communities. And this has been a big topic of discussion up in San Francisco, where scooter share was introduced, and people are like freaking out about all of the scooters all over the place that literally appeared like overnight on the sidewalks. And so what do we want government's role to be in allowing or prohibiting business activity, either in these kind of public spaces or in residential areas? And a much more complex issue around this question is the purposeful design of our public spaces and communities, and how we design those in such a way to accommodate technology advances like assistive technologies. Delivery robots are running around Palo Alto now, public Wi-Fi, and autonomous vehicles. And A.D. Tomer at the Brookings Institute recently wrote this really great article I recommend to you around local planning for autonomous vehicles. And he reminds us that we've been through big innovation like this before when affordable motor vehicles first became popularized. And in large part, the car won out in those battles back then. And so ironically, it's now time to put ourselves in the driver's seat of how our communities are going to plan for self-driving cars. So the final area I wanted to, okay. So let me just say the final area I want to touch on was the impact of the tech community itself on our communities. And you're seeing it here in Silicon Valley as well, back in my home community of Seattle. Great prosperity, but not evenly distributed, lots of impacts on housing and other issues. And I'm sure we will have lots of questions about that and have conversation about it.
Thank you. Thank you both. So I'm hearing several themes that run through, even though these are at very different levels of conversation in one sense. There are several themes that are running through both of them. One of them has to do with regulation and the role of regulation. We live in a world in the Silicon Valley where even saying regulation seems to send chills up. Business will flee, the corporations are hysterical about it. But regulation, as you pointed out, is the backdrop of an awful lot of what gives us security in using the technology that exists. So one issue I want to raise is regulation. Another has to do with privacy and where the boundaries of privacy are. And I think by bringing in local government into the larger discussion, because the focus of the privacy debate has really been around the kind of Facebook issues. And there are times when you want government to, in a sense, violate privacy of perhaps a different kind. So privacy is another domain I would like to spend some attention on. And then the third one is really democracy. So the kind of thing that Nate is really talking about is ways in which the internet can interfere with our voting systems and that level of democracy, but there's also the local level democracy and the local level governance and how you bring people into that process and how you use technology both for good and the problems that it can cause. So why don't we start with the regulatory issue, if that's all right. And whoever wants to jump in there, I will let them. Maybe you should, Nate, because Carrie raised a set of issues about regulation that I haven't heard you talk about before.
Well, I've always been a little mystified by Silicon Valley's aversion and allergic reaction to regulation at all. And they sort of haven't read their political science textbooks on this a little bit.
I agree.
Which is because, and they're paying the price for it, because what they're ending up with is bad regulation, and what they should be working with government to do is have better regulation. And the problem is that the Europeans are, of course, the tail that's going to wag the dog here, because they have decided, that the American companies, right, who are now essentially affecting those democracies and those economies in a major way, are, the European governments have had enough of them, right? And I should say that this is sort of the flip side of the sovereignty issue I was talking about before, right? these companies are seen as exporters of American values around the world, right? And I'm always fascinated when I talk to the leaders of these firms, the international context in which they operate. So if you say, for example, here's how you should deal with fake news, right? They say, all right, well, here's how it's going to play out in Myanmar. Here's how it's going to play out in Turkey, right? And they're thinking about all the countries at once. But so the European approach to this right now is taken, for example, by the German so-called fake news bill, which is not really about fake news, but is about piercing intermediary liability. And by that we mean holding Google, Facebook, and other platforms liable for speech that occurs on their platforms, right? Now that has all kinds of deleterious effects for speech on the platforms, as well as the kind of position you put these platforms in to overregulate and to use AI to do it. I can talk a little bit more about that. But it's a consequence of their egotism and inability to think seriously about the responsibility that they have for the effects that they're having on democracy. Now, I was impressed that a week or two ago when Zuckerberg went before Congress, he declared, for example, Facebook now supports something called the Honest Ads Act, which they hadn't up until that point. And that was about trying to have greater transparency in who's behind political advertising, right? And Facebook actually is going to go farther than, at least they've announced, they're going to go farther than the law requires in trying to provide information about, say, all kinds of political ads on their platform. But that's exactly what they should be doing. One of the things, though, that you realize, and this came out in those hearings where it was clear that the members of Congress had not opened a Facebook page, right? I mean, that they really had no idea what the platform was was about, to the point where the interchange between Senator Orrin Hatch and Mark Zuckerberg is like one for the record books, where he's like, well, so how do you make money if you don't produce anything? As if he'd as if he discovered something. It's like, well, it's all, and Zuckerberg, who apparently thought it was like a trick question, he's like, well, we sell advertising. And so the point is that through the Honest Ads Act is actually flawed in many significant ways because they're trying to take a TV paradigm and apply it online. But if these tech firms worked with the government regulators to craft what would be sensible regulations to deal with privacy, to deal with these democracy effects, they'd be a lot better off.
So what I'm hearing, though, is really interesting, because here is Congress, which seems incompetent in terms of thinking about the companies it has to regulate, versus a place like King County government, which is extremely competent in thinking. I mean, when we think about some of the innovation in regulation, it's actually been coming from the urban space and trying to deal with an Uber or some of the other sharing apps.
Yeah, and I think there's a big question about who gets to regulate, right? Is it the federal government level? Is it the local government level? Is it counties? Is it cities? Is it the states? There are, I think, these big issues around privacy, around anti-discrimination, where I really feel like we need the federal government to step up and provide a platform. It's not going to be it's not going to be effective to try to do that at the local level. But when you get into issues around, the real shape of the places in which we actually live every day, there's a lot of space there where, residents and the government and together need to kind of decide what we want our communities to look like, and then how we want to regulate businesses as a result of that.
Can I just say one other thing here, which is that one of the reasons these firms should be gravitating toward better regulation is that otherwise they get put in these terrible positions to decide what speech is valuable and not. And so that a lot of this intermediary liability legislation in Europe is saying, all right, you, Facebook, you have to take down within 24 hours of notice illegal speech that occurs on your platform.
Right.
It's like, what if your firm, I mean, and I teach First Amendment law here at Stanford. I couldn't do that, you know? It's extremely challenging. So the point about government regulation, smartly done, is you force the government to make these really hard choices. And they are difficult decisions about what is hate speech, about what is obscenity, about what is defamation and the like. And if you, but their allergy to government regulation has led them to fight against all that government regulation, you know, no matter what the context is.
So let's move into the democracy space, because that's also something you're both talking about, but at different levels. So Carrie, let's start with you. And so when you're talking about creating a local government and a citizenry that's able to decide on how its world is going to look, how do you talk about that in democratic terms? What does that mean?
Well, that's a really big question.
Yeah, really.
You know, in the Seattle region in particular, I think we're having a lot of struggle with that. As inequities in our communities are getting wider, there seems, and it's sort of echoing some of what Nate is saying about the polarization in conversation that's happening on the internet. I don't really see the polarization in terms of the political kind of dialogue happening as much in the King County area, but there's definitely this polarization in our life experience that informs how we look at issues of access to technology or the use of technology or the regulation of technology. And, you know, we're actively trying to work in King County government in bridging those divides, bringing communities and grassroots leaders to the table with business communities and trying to find pathways through both to open up the prosperity that the tech community is bringing to more people from our local communities, but also to expand you know, the view and understanding both by the business community and by, you know, regular people about what the issues are and what the solutions can be. And I think if we can really foster those kind of cross-sector conversations, that's where we're going to find solutions that are going to be stronger and I think more long-lasting as well.
But let me press you on that a minute, because Seattle and King County is a place where we have some really major corporations, right?
Yep.
So I live in Amazonia, basically. It's right there. We've got.
You know, that makes you Wonder Woman.
Yeah, I know that. I'm an Amazonian. We have Starbucks, we have Costco, we have Microsoft, the big bear in the room. How do you hold, and all of them are in King County, so how do you know, we're having trouble at the federal level holding these corporations accountable. How do you do that at the local level? I mean, they're part of that community. They're just deciding what that community looks like.
Well, and I think it's one of the paradoxes of the Seattle region, actually, is that we do have these big, globally iconic businesses that are sort of homegrown, right, from our region. And, you know, I think heretofore, they've been very focused on growing their global business and not, you know, not as focused as I think in other places on the local community. And that's starting to change. I think it's both as many of those businesses have matured, they start to think more about, the leaders start to think more about their own personal legacies.
You mean as the founders past the age of 30?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, really what they want to do in the local community. But it's also, it's kind of this mutual accountability, right? I mean, for those businesses to continue to survive in our region, they can't survive, they can't keep growing businesses based on importing talent from elsewhere. It's just not sustainable. So we really have to figure out collectively how we're going to reorient both public and private, for example, workforce development systems to move towards giving more opportunity for people from the local community to access those jobs. And I don't think that's a matter of regulation. I think it's a matter of people forming relationships and getting together and understanding the problem better and talking and developing solutions. And there's mutual accountability there.
And how do you deal with the issue of accountability and thinking about it in terms of, I mean, you're dealing with Facebook right now and Google and all these companies. You've been talking about the monopoly problem. But it's a larger problem of accountability and a set of democratic institutions which may not be particularly effective at this point in dealing with that question.
Well, so one of the, I think, common themes here is that you've got these global firms that are now dealing with, sovereign entities, whether at the local level or at the state or national level, and how do they deal with that? And we don't have a great model for for what they should be doing. I mean, there are always proposals, for example, that Facebook should have, like when it went public, it should have given like 1 share to each one of the Facebook users, so then you could have had sort of corporate democracy working through Facebook. But they
didn't do that.
They did not. No. I mean, they are effectively a monarchy, right? I mean,
Tying the king's hand.
But one scandal with Cambridge Analytica cost them $50 billion in the space of 3 weeks, and so there are checks on them, and some of these checks are going to be, I mean, they're going to be like I said, it's going to be the Europeans, it's going to be a lot of these other countries that bring the force of government to bear on them, and we'll see, what the spillover effects are in the U.S. I mean, I think that when Carrie was talking, the thing that occurred to me, right, was how local governments are bending over backwards for these firms, right? It's the exact opposite of this problem, so that you end up with, this, I mean, anyone saw that Saturday Night Live skit about, all the cities trying to compete for the next Amazon headquarters, right? And it's just like with sports stadiums and it's just, all right, how much of our future will we mortgage for this, this firm to come in here? And so with the social media companies, I think it's actually a little bit different. As I said, they're seen as exporters of American culture, as well as our particular view of speech, right? And so there's a real fight that's going on between these governments and these foreign firms. If you look at the big internet, for the most part, when you talk about regulating the internet, you're talking about regulating the corridor from Seattle down to Palo Alto, right? And that's, there's a real question, and Timothy Garton-Ash at Oxford has a book on this, or where he makes this argument, which is the future of the internet going to be determined by the United States, Europe, or China? Right? 3 very different models about how the internet will be structured. Right now, we're sort of all competing in one way or another, with China has this sort of walled garden idea. You've got Europe, which is sort of piercing intermediary liability. And we are really extremists, right? The U.S. is out on a limb, not just with respect to government regulation, but our views of speech. Right? When I teach First Amendment law, talk about all those areas I just mentioned: defamation, obscenity, hate speech, and the like. We are all the way. There's no other country in the world that's comparable to the United States in our libertarianism when it comes to speech. And so these firms, for the most part, are homegrown in the way they think about not just political expression, but expression generally. And there's a fight against that all over the world.
I think we should open, sorry, did you want to get one more thing in? I want to open it up to questions.
Just want to pick up on the competition among cities over Amazon's second headquarters. And it's actually kind of instructive, because if you look at what Amazon is looking for, it's many of the same things that we want as our own communities, right? A great transportation network, good education, career pathways into that industry. And yet, I think a lot of, some of the responses that I think you're seeing from communities are very much kind of this old style of economic development incentives. And those aren't really the things that firms need the most. So I think there are areas where we can, work together better to try to address some of the big issues.
Great. Okay, I'm ready to take questions. And what is going to happen with the questions is I will point to somebody, and a microphone will come to you from one side of the room. So please use the microphone because we are taping this, and 2, please introduce yourself. So I saw a question right there, and then the second question will be in the back.
My name's Eric.
Who promised me he would ask a question.
I have a question for Karen. So you're talking about kind of the people left behind from technology, communities left behind. Is there a really compelling, strong argument that you've been able to concoct for companies so they don't feel backed into this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't think it's about providing people who don't have the necessary competencies, you know, to have jobs in the tech industry. What we have to figure out is how we work better together to prepare people for those jobs. And there's a lot of public investment and there's a lot of private investment in training people up. And we can probably, I think, be making those investments much more productive by working together. So I don't know if that answers your question.
He'll be at dinner. He can push it
Great.
later.
Thank you. My name is Wynn Derman. I graduated from the business school, and your talk has been very enlightening to me, and I decided I would ask you a question. And the question has to do with how would I describe the United States? And I'd have to say in the last 100 years, I would say we're an accordion. We open up to business and doing all the things they want to do until there's a catastrophe, like Standard Oil forming a monopoly, and then government comes in and cracks down on it. We open up to the banks doing all they could do in 2008 to ruin the economy and kill Wall Street, and then we come back and we try to fix it up after the fact. And we're doing the same thing now that we've been doing for 100 years. We're letting all these problems get out of hand, and then we're turning to government and asking them to fix it. And then 10 years later, we have pressure from the administration that turns around and says, we've got to undo Dodd-Frank. Have we lost the right knowledge that tells us that we're going to go back and do this again with the same mistakes we had? Now, if my feeling is true, your image doesn't fit what I think we're going to have to do to make this better.
I think that was to you, Nate.
Okay. Look, I don't think that the U.S. government is actually going to regulate social media in any significant way. What's interesting is you are getting a political push from both the right and the left, so that the right feel, and you could see this in the hearings, where the right is worried that the liberals in Silicon Valley are editing and censoring conservative expression. The left is worried about the monopoly power of these firms and how it's, how they're using that economic power for bad ends. And so there is this strange coalition which doesn't fit our normal way of thinking about the polarized politics of our time. Yet, if there's going to be regulation, and you're going to have to find some way for the parties to come together on it right now, and it doesn't. I mean, the government can barely do anything, let alone regulate in this area where they don't understand it, and so. It's hard to, but that's why I think it's going to be coming from abroad, and that there is what we call sort of the Brussels effect, right? That there's a, and we sort of like what we have here in the California effect in the United States, where like whether it's environmental regulations and the like, California can set a standard because we're so big that would affect the country, and Brussels may be able to set a rule that's going to affect the structure of the internet and how expression develops. That accordion phenomenon you're describing is not, you're right, but that's the way government works, right? I mean, until there's pressure and a significant impetus for reform, you don't get it. This area, but there are no easy answers of the types of questions that I mentioned, right? Of these phenomena of disinformation and hate speech and anonymity and the like. These are extremely fraught areas, right? If you start thinking about, for example, a White House Office of Information Integrity, right? That's not exactly something a lot of us would be running to support, right? If as much as you might be afraid of the fake news problem online, government reactions to it are pretty frightening. And so these are extremely difficult problems. To some extent, based on the kind of examples you put out there, you might think that antitrust law would be an answer in this area. Look, these firms are too big. Let's treat them as monopolies. But I've talked to a lot of the folks who criticize these companies on antitrust grounds, and there are similarities with other monopolies. But fundamentally, the power of Google is its search engine, right? And the power of Facebook is its news feed, right? And you cannot break those things up, right? It's not like AT&T or these other kinds of firms. You could regulate them, right? You can try to prevent them from combining, buying Instagram and WhatsApp and like that, or you can prevent, Alphabet from gluing together, everything from rockets to search engines. But it's not, if the problem from a democracy standpoint is the way that they curate information, it's not clear to me that there's an antitrust solution to that.
Mm-hmm. This woman right here.
Thank you. My name is Angelique. I'm an educator at a local high school. So I was curious, how might we engage youth since they are digital natives, not only in the democratic process, but also, as you mentioned, in the need for having regulation, and what might that look like? And I don't know if you have any examples today. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a very great question. So in the Seattle region, we have a huge influx of younger people who are coming to work for these technology companies, and other kinds of companies as well. And what we're finding from looking at some of the survey data is a lot of young people really want to be connected into the social fabric of their communities and working on social issues, and they don't know how. And in the Seattle region in particular, a lot of them feel quite isolated, they don't quite know how to fit into the community. And then at the other end of the spectrum, where you're seeing a lot of people who have been long-time residents in the region also starting to feel like they're disconnected as well. So we're actually trying to really think about that. And I don't have an answer for you today, but I think it's a really important question, and how we tap into the energy of this kind of younger generation of people who bring new ideas, new kinds of solutions, and a new energy to the problems.
I sort of see the Parkland shooting as like a test case for whether the digital natives of young people are going to have a unique political impact, right? I think the jury is still out on that. But if ever there was an opportunity to sort of see whether democratic mobilization can occur uniquely among this group because of their digital savvy, then that's it. I mean, the way that they've sort of gone after Marco Rubio is sort of an interesting, for those who've seen it, it's sort of an interesting test case, and, never anger a 16-year-old. But they,
Certainly not a group of them.
Yeah, right. And so I still, we have a project here as part of this project on democracy and the internet. Sam Weinberg in the education department is trying to develop curricula for high school students, digital literacy, and particularly to help with media literacy and thinking about how to distinguish between real and fake news. But the truth is, this is not a problem just for young people. This is a problem for older folks as well.
And we also have a problem at a project at the center that Sarah Ogilvie, who's sitting there, is part of, on the digitally native and how they're forming values and language and interactions and what that means for a whole variety. So it's a research project, which then will hopefully inform some of the kinds of policies and activities that need to be done. Thomas, I'm going to wait on you because you'll be at dinner. So this woman right here.
Thank you very much. Michelle Littlefield from the city of Redwood City. I lead the analytics efforts there next door. So I've heard a couple of things tonight. One is that Facebook and other companies are being described as a new monarchy. And I also heard the term or phrase computational propaganda. From both the federal and local levels, do you see an emergence of a new form of government? Do you have any insights on that? And how should we, as government employees, respond to that?
Well, so look, they're corporations. Right? It's sort of, there's a question is the normal checks on multinational corporations still do work here? I mean, so whether it's an oil company or whether it's Facebook, right? There are some characteristics that are similar to these firms that have, or the Dutch East India Company. There's all kinds of precedents for regulating them in particular ways. What makes this different is the control over the information, right? So that the way that they curate information is particularly pronounced. So they're in a sense they are. Government-like, right? They talk about controlling the public square, right? And they have projects on that. And so I think the way I look at it is that we need to think about their control of the communication environment and the ecosystem in some ways the way that we've thought about governments, right? Because as they get that much power and that big reach, we need to start thinking, well, what are the rules that they should follow? Let me say that I think they think about it this way. Now, there is a caricature of these platforms that all of the decisions that they're making in this space that I've described as being motivated by money. I don't think that's right. I mean, I think that that a lot of it is motivated by these libertarian First Amendment kind of values that they've learned since growing up in the United States, most of them. And I think that they have a typical kind of Silicon Valley utopianism that characterizes all kinds of other things that go on around here. So I think that they are sort of thinking of themselves, if not as governments, at least as communities, right, that have certain rules that transcend governmental and national borders. And so they're sort of muddling their way through as to what the right way to do this is. And you see this in the way that they've, particularly Facebook has responded to the Russian abuse of their platform, right? They now admit, that that this was a problem, but that was not what Facebook was originally thought about. When Mark Zuckerberg was in his Harvard dorm room, right, he wasn't thinking about Russian influence on American elections, right? I mean, this. You've seen the movie. Yeah. That's not what it was about. And so, but it's it's moved in that direction. Now they realize that they have responsibility there, but realize that they're going to get criticized no matter what they do, right? They're either going to regulate too much, and that will have a viewpoint discriminatory effect. Some points of view will be sort of submerged or taken off the platform. Some of them, you might like those viewpoints here for a time, but in other countries you might not. Or they're going to regulate not enough, and so then you have the anarchy, which is, produces the bot problem, fake news, and the like.
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of new governance models that are either emerging or will need to emerge simply because, in many respects, our federal government is not working so great right now. So we're seeing a lot of more of the innovation around some of these issues coming from larger regional governments. And in a lot of ways, I think there's some great opportunities there to work in different ways, work across sectors on new kinds of models. And in a lot of ways, I think, that's really problematic. We need the federal government to provide some kind of, foundation for addressing some of these issues at a national level or even an international level. And we're also, it concerns me that we're moving to this environment where you have, fairly well-off metro areas being capable of tackling some of these issues and other areas of the country not. I mean, what's a tiny little city government going to do, with respect to some of these very, very complex issues when you have a citizen legislature or a resident legislature where people are working full time and they're trying to do their city council job at night. It's pretty complex.
I can't help but now recognize Thomas, who, as president of Estonia, actually did a tremendous amount in figuring out new governance structures around use of the internet.
I'm Thomas Elves at the Hoover Institute. And I just wanted to say that one thing that has not been discussed, especially when you're talking, Nate, about the European approach and free speech. Actually, I think that's a minor issue in Europe. I think it's a much bigger issue, especially if you read the New York Times piece last Sunday. I mean, communal violence in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, India that is fomented through Facebook. It's an issue there. In Europe, the real issue is data protection and the massive use of data. And this is something that hasn't been discussed here at all. And I was wondering, I mean, that's where the regulation is going to hit them, and it's their economic model. So I was wondering what you think of what will happen with people's data, and that's also I think where the public reaction is going to be biggest, not against fake news, but because everyone has their favorite fake news, but with your private personal data.
Yeah. And Europe's leading the way on this. And, it's interesting. So there's a piece, I think, in the Times today, or was it yesterday, on how the privacy protections actually preserve the status of incumbents of these big firms because they will be able to survive this. It's not clear that a startup company will be able to thrive under these new privacy regulations. I'll say one other thing for this effort that I'm leading with Gary King to try to study the impact of Facebook on democracy or social media generally. It's not clear we can do the kind of studies in Europe that we want to, because you cannot get, the privacy law will prevent us from analyzing pretty much any individual level data to figure out whether, communications, the kind of media consumption that people experience has effects on, their behavior on the platform or what they do. And so it has this sort of strange chilling effect on trying to figure out the answers to some of the problems that people think are most pressing. I think both of the fake news and hate speech and the like are problems. And then the data privacy issue is one that they're taking very seriously. And these are ones that I think you could see, there might be some room for US regulation here as well, but I do think that Europe is leading the way on this and has been for some time. The Cambridge Analytica scandal has now become the frame through which we view this selling of data or the way that Facebook looks at your data. Cambridge Analytica, I now think, is just kind of a metaphor for the larger problem. I mean, the Cambridge Analytica breach is, I think, more complicated than people understand, and probably in the scheme of things, of all the other privacy violations you experience from being on these kinds of platforms, I don't think it was as big a deal as people are giving it. But again, it's a metaphor through which we see this problem. And you're right that it does cut right to the business model. So if you start thinking about what would affect the bottom line of these companies, I think you're right that if they are unable to harvest data and then allow for ad targeting based on that. But like I said, in some ways it's too late, right? Because you are still, no matter what happens with these firms, they still have this position of getting so many eyeballs, right? So so while the ad targeting might not be as micro-targeted as it would be if they were harvesting a lot of this data and selling it, they're still going to be in the position of being the dominant communication environment.
Yeah. We have time for one last question, I think. This young man back here.
Hello, I'm Daniel, and I'm a high school senior from Monte Vista High School. And I had a question regarding hate speech, and I'd like to echo the sentiments of Senator Ted Cruz during his congressional hearing questions of how certain hate speech or certain conservative news or speech was actually labeled as hate speech by Facebook or Twitter or even on Reddit. And so I've noticed that you stated that hate speech has been increasing, but I'd like to question if that increase in hate speech has just been the regulation of conservative news or the like being removed or censored, and does this somehow concern the marketplace of nonpartisan ideas, and does it put it into jeopardy?
So I said, I hope I was clear, that it's not clear that hate speech has actually been rising, and there's an interesting study by the NYU Social Media and Political Participation Lab on just this question. And so how do you define hate speech, right? And how do you make it so it's not coterminous with a certain political ideology. They use a really interesting method to measure hate speech. What they did is they went into subreddits, which are like avowedly neo-Nazi. Trust, all of us would agree that this is racist stuff, right? They did this with misogynist groups. They did this with anti-Semitic, white nationalists and the like. And they then used machine learning to figure out how racists talk, okay? They then took that, algorithm, that AI, and then applied it to Twitter. Right, and so it's not enough to just look at racial epithets, most of which are banned on Twitter anyway. But you got to figure out sort of what is the way that racists, based on these avowedly racist subreddits, how they talk, and then they find, so look, not a monotonic increase in hate speech over time, but episodic. Right around Charlottesville, you're going to see this. Actually, after the 2016 election, a spike in misogynist speech and the like. But there's no question that there are cauldrons of the internet, right, that are just themselves proudly dedicated toward racist, homophobic, extremist, neo-Nazi speech and the like. There is a risk, you're right, that, especially in this day and age, that, there's going to be a disparate political impact if you start regulating hate speech, right? But, we can debate whether, if what the president says about Mexico, whether that's hate speech or not, or whether what people are, whether the Charlottesville protests, whether that is hate speech or not. But, if you're going to regulate those kinds of terms and that kind of speech, it's going to have a disparate impact on a particular ideological group. The problem here, and maybe this is also where you're gesturing, is that once it becomes difficult, right, to just have humans to be the moderators for what is hate speech, because you've got all, you're talking about all kinds of speech on these platforms. And so does the AI go too far, right? And, that's an empirical question. These are, super sensitive areas that, we haven't, in the US, for the most part, the government really has a hard time regulating hate speech. You can regulate what are called fighting words, like words that will lead to, you punching me. But when it comes to racist speech, it's actually quite difficult under the First Amendment to regulate it. But these platforms, in this respect, are not government. So if they want to, if they want to be viewpoint discriminatory, if they want to regulate hate speech in an expansive way, they have the right to do so.
Well, I want to thank both of our fabulous speakers and thank all of you. Come back next year.
Okay.